This is American Government for Wednesday, September 29th. And also, as it became clear in class today, that many of you are not working hard enough in this course, as was probably reflected in some of your test grades, but especially from what I could tell from class discussion. You have to keep up with this material. You have to do the PRQs. And again, if you want a standard for how thorough they should be, please look at the 2 sample exams that I sent out. Again, you're paying good money to come to this university, and there's no point in wasting your time and your money by not working up to expectations here. You're grown-ups now, so behave like grown-ups. Get to work. So, since I had to cover some of Wednesday's material, which it was clear that many of you had not watched the lecture or watched it very thoroughly, sorry to be so critical, but I was a little disappointed. Um, and again, there's nothing I'd rather do than teach college. It's what I was born to do, and I happen to love politics, American government, and political philosophy. I want students to do their best, not their most mediocre, or their, again, you're paying for this, or someone's paying for this. So you should probably, again, and as I said at the beginning of class, if you were a professional musician, or a professional athlete, none of you would expect to go out for a sport and do as lackluster and little amount of work as you did for this class. So this is I do hope that the situation turns around because I've been teaching this material for 40 years and I know that students can do it. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the lecture notes for today. And then strictly speaking, the material for Wednesday was the amendments to the Constitution and how to group and understand them. So what we talked about today was I talked about the vesting clause, but first, if you look on the first page of the notes, the basic structure of each of Article 1, 2, and 3, and the reason that we're taking these together as opposed to the general overview of all 7 articles of the Constitution last week was because these set up the new national government. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, which was a confederation, not a true national government, um, the single bicameral Congress was the only institution on the national level. There was no executive branch, there was no judicial branch, hence Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. And if you're looking at the first page of the notes from today, the basic structure, which is easier to see in Article 1 because it's longer and more detailed for all kinds of interesting reasons. Some scholars argue that and historians argue it's because Congress was supposed to be the most important branch. That's probably not the case. It's just that they needed to spell out more of the issues of the union and representation in the union. Plus, it's true, Congress would have more responsibilities because, for instance, Congress is essentially, through law, actually constructs the executive branch besides the two top executive officials, the president and the vice president. Plus, Article 2 mentions other inferior executive officers, but Congress has to, by law, create and fund all the offices of the executive branch, which, by the way, when we turn to the presidency and the executive branch later on in the class, now is about 2.5 to 3 million individuals, including the Department of Defense and the armed forces. But there was also no judicial branch, so Article 3 sets up the judicial branch. And again, Congress creates that branch. So, nevertheless, the same basic outline where you see the vesting clauses which grant the essential power of that institution and also outline its essential structure. Then in Article 1, Section 2 and 3, in Article 2, Section 1, and in Article 3, Section 1, you essentially get the structure of each branch. There, for instance, in Article 1, Section 2, and by the way, it would be useful to be going back and forth between the Constitution and the last page of today's notes, the chartograph of Articles 1, 2, and 3, which kind of form a parallel comparison. I guess it's a comparogram rather than a chartograph. So Article 1, Section 2 and 3 structure the House of Representatives. And remember we said in class today that what structure means for an institution, it means things like size, a basic layout like a single person, a numerous. You can tell, for instance, that Congress is composed not only of 2 houses, but multiple human beings in both. And again, the single presidency, the single person presidency that we talked about. But in Article 1, Section 2, again, you get the layout of the House of Representatives. Who can be a member? What are the qualifications for a member? What are the qualifications for voting for members of the House? And I went over that principle today in Article 1, Section 2, that the electors of the members of the House, that is to say, the everyday voters in each state, shall have the qualifications as the most numerous branch of the state legislature. And that meant in the states, especially the ones that had bicameral legislatures, the lower house, the more numerous house, generally had the most open and widespread qualifications. But do note, and we'll see this when we turn to the material about amendments, many of the amendments change the basic qualification for voters, and we went over that in class today too. In Article 1, Section 3, the structure of the Senate is set up. A smaller body, indirectly elected so that it would be less tied to changes in public opinion, less representative, by the way. And when we turn to Congress, we'll see what that means. And remember, when you look at Article 1, Section 3, the Senate was divided into thirds. Each Senate would basically, senators have a 6-year term as opposed to the 2-year term of the House. But if you look in Article 1, Section 3, this first Senate was divided into 3/3. One that would serve a 2-year term, a 4-year term, and then the full 6-year term, and then the next, and so forth. So that and this is true of today's Senate, whereas the whole House, all 435 members of the House in today's House of Representatives, stand for election at the same time every 2 years. Only a third of the Senate goes up because the framers wanted more of an informed body with more institutional capacity, more reflection, more stability. And you'll see this explains the basic difference between the House and Senate. Don't forget, the original Senate was elected by state legislatures. Of course, don't forget, the state legislatures were elected by the people. That's rather like a parallel to the Electoral College, where we elect the college, the president of the United States, but we elect the electors who elect the president. So as you're going to see in Article 2, we actually have a 3-step presidential election, and possibly 4-step, where the people choose the electors choose the electors vote for candidates for president. Those electoral ballots are sent to Congress to be counted and opened in joint session. This is the 3rd stage, and that was, by the way, this January 6th. That was the whole riot that dismayed everybody on January 6th when the joint session of Congress was counting the electoral votes. Now, if there's no majority of electoral votes for any particular president, vice president, then the 4th possible stage of the presidential election, and this is somewhat procedural, by the way, in Article 2, would be then the president would be chosen by the House of Representatives, and the Senate would choose the vice president. But we'll talk more about that later on. So then, if you look at Article 1, for instance, and if you're following the comparogram, sections 4 and 5 are and essentially 6 and 7, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are procedural. Article 1, Section 2 and 3 set up the basic structure of House and Senate. Sections 4, 5, and 6 outline the governing of elections, which is, by the way, controversial right now, and also the internal procedures. Like you learn in Article 1, Section 5 that a simple majority is necessary to do the basic business, which also means passing legislation. Remember, there's a long PRQ about what kinds of majorities are necessary for what kinds of actions. And to go back to Article 1, Section 2 and 3, don't forget the impeachment power. And the trial and the power to try impeachments is divided between the House and the Senate, and look at the special majorities involved there. Article 6 is special privileges and immunities of members of the House, like a salary, being free from arrest on to and back from their session, but also limitations. They can't hold any other post in the United States government while they're a member of the House and Senate. And then, and by the way, if I'm going across the other 2 branches, Article 1, Article 2, Section 1 is both. It's the vesting clause that grants the executive power, and you should pay very close attention to the issues that we talked about in class today. But then also has some structural information: the single-person presidency, the vice presidency, and then the complex mode of election that I just talked about, the 3-stage and possible 4-stage, a presidential election where the people choose electors, electors choose the president, and the third stage where the Congress counts the electoral votes and declares who's winner. And if there's no majority, which the Constitution requires a majority of electoral votes, and if you've done your math, and you've already mentioned that there are 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, that means that there are 538 electoral votes total. Why do 538? Why not 35 by adding the number of states that a representative that a state has plus the number of senators? It's because 3 additional electoral votes were created by the 23rd Amendment and given to the District of Columbia, which is not a state, but their people have 3 electoral votes, so they can vote for the president. So there are 538 votes, possible electoral college votes, and that's why a majority to elect a president is 270. So that's in Article 1. But then don't forget there are some other important aspects in Article 2, Section 1, like the succession, the oath of office, and some other incidental aspects of the construction and operation of the presidency. In Article 3, Section 1 sets up the basic structure of the judiciary, which is created by Congress by law. But as we saw in class, the structure of the judiciary is inherently hierarchical, like a military organization, or pyramidal, with one Supreme Court and such courts, which we'll go into the structure later on in the course. And then procedures. I already talked about Article 1, Sections 4, 5, and 6, elections, internal procedures of each House, the privileges of each member, but then especially in Article 1, Section 7, literally the procedure of how a bill becomes a law, how it's what's habable is, or I'm just a bill, if you've ever listened to Schoolhouse Rock after school. So Article 1, Section 7 is purely procedural, and pay very close attention to the majorities required for passing legislation, for overriding a veto, etc. And what the president's unique role is. And remember, not every power of every branch is listed in that branch's article. Like, for instance, the president signs legislation, which means that for limited purposes, the president has some legislative authority. But that's in Article 1, Section 7. And the president appoints officers in the executive branch and the judiciary. But in Article 1, Section 2, you learn that the Senate has to confirm those appointments, at least on the senior level. And now Article 1, Section 8 lists the specific 18 powers of Congress. Remember, I went over the language of the vesting clause today, which is further on the front page of today's notes, and pointed out that whereas Article 1, Section 1 says all legislative powers herein granted, means that when you look down to Article 1, Section 8, that's where the herein granting is going, and the specific powers of Congress are listed. So even though in the modern world, in the 20th and 21st century, we interpret Congress's powers very broadly, nevertheless, technically, Congress can only pass legislation when it fits one of those 18 categories of specific powers. And as I mentioned in class today, the president's power seems to have been interpreted more generally because Article 1, Section 1, the vesting clause says all executive power shall be vested in a president, or the executive power. And as I pointed out in class today, generally speaking, our politicians, lawyers, and even the Supreme Court have generally understood that means that in Articles 2, Section 2 and 3, that lists presidential powers like commander-in-chief, appointing officers, negotiating treaties, commissioning officers, convening Congress, etc. The specific powers listed of the president, that the president's power is more general and is not confined to that listing. And then in Article 3, Sections 1 and 2, the judicial powers extend to all cases and controversies under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and the treaties. And so and then, by the way, the procedural part of Article 3 is the complex discussion of jurisdiction. Federal jurisdiction of what kind of cases can come up in federal court, and those are generally by party if you look in Article 1, Article 3, Section 2. And then also look at the important distinction between original and appellate jurisdiction, where the original jurisdiction, where a court case can originate in the Supreme Court, which is pretty few today, or with the cases that have to come up through the appeals process, through the appellate courts that Congress creates. And then the last section of each article is what I would call limits. So whereas Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers of Congress, what Congress can do, Article 1, Section 9 lists the powers of Congress that Congress can't do. And so, for instance, it can't pass an ex post facto law, can't pass a bill of attainder where you accuse through legislation a person of a specific crime without a trial, no titles of nobility. And by the way, don't forget the 3 places in the Constitution, there's a PRQ for this, where the Constitution refers to but doesn't mention slavery. Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 clause, Article 1, Section 9, the migration and importation, the slave trade clause, and Article 4, Section 2, the fugitive slave clause. So remember, there's a question about where that is and when the first time the Constitution mentioned slavery, which you should know from what we'll be doing on Wednesday, which is actually today, sort of, except today is kind of Monday. So Article 1, Section 9, no money can be taken out of the Treasury without an appropriation of law. And by the way, the whole budget and everything, we're coming to a very big controversy now because our fiscal year, that is to say, the financial year for the United States government, begins and ends on September 30th and October 1st. And so the question of the ability of the United States government to draw money and spend money and borrow money is one of the big controversies right now in our system. So Article 1, Section 10, by the way, puts some limitations on the state governments. Same thing, like no titles of nobility or ex post facto laws. They can't pass laws that destroy contractual obligation, like mortgages and debts. And also, states can't declare war. They can't engage in treaties, and they can't privilege their import duties from one state to another, etc. So that's the basic structure of Article 1. Article 2 follows the same structure as we've seen, and Article 2, Section 4 is the impeachment article, which is a kind of obviously a limitation on the presidency and presidential power. And Article 3, Section 3 is certain limitations in terms of the definition of treason. It puts limits on what the courts can punish as treason and limits on what Congress can declare as treasonable. So that's the essential outline of Article 1, 2, and 3, which create the new national government. And again, you might want to go back and forth between the Constitution, the PRQs, and this chart that compares them all. So for the material for Wednesday, this is now Wednesday, September 29th, the last part of the Constitution is the amendments. And as I mentioned last week, the Constitution has been relatively rarely amended, only 27 amendments in the course of almost 240 years since 1789 when it went into effect. And the point of this discussion today is to help you essentially organize and see the nature of the amendments and try to remember as much as possible. And by the way, well, you'll see there are some interesting things about these 27 amendments. Others, like the state constitutions of many states, have been amended hundreds of times, and oftentimes the amendments grow so great that they actually have to reform a new constitution. And the same with many other national constitutions. So the Constitution has been, for a 7-page constitution, which is actually pretty slim as constitutions go, the Constitution has been pretty flexibly interpreted, although it has been amended. So there are 27 amendments, and here are 3 ways to group them to help you understand their content. You can group them historically, that is to say, when they occurred. You can group them by the mode of ratification. And to remind you from our discussion last week in my recorded lecture, Article 5 is the amendment article. Remember, the 2 supermajorities that determine the amendment process is 2/3 for proposing, 3/4 for ratifying. And there are in turn 2 ways to propose amendments: 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or 2/3 of the states call for a convention, and in turn 2 modes of ratifying constitutional amendments: 3/4 of the states, or 3/4 of state conventions. So the reason you can group the amendments by mode of ratification is all the amendments have been ratified by state legislatures. Ratified by the state legislatures, with the exception of the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition, which was ratified by state conventions. So that's easy. 26. So the 21st Amendment is the only amendment that's been ratified by state conventions, unlike, by the way, the original Constitution in Article 1, Article 7, as I pointed out in class today and last week. So all other amendments, the other 26 amendments, have all been ratified by the state legislature. The other way that you can group the amendments is thematically, which is to say what kind of changes. And you'll see there are 3 kinds of changes, and we'll go through these changes which either add to or certify or protect individual rights and immunities of individual people. We'll go over those, but like things like freedom of speech, religion, right to bear arms, the right to trial by jury, and these kinds of things. Individual protections. The second kind of amendment is changes to institutions, like the 12th Amendment that changed the Electoral College, the 17th Amendment that switched election of senators from state legislatures to the people of the states, direct election of senators. And then, of course, all categories by theme have to have a miscellaneous theme. And I'll just say what those are right now, though we can come back to them. And that's the 18th Amendment, which is the prohibition that said no booze, and the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, which said, yay, booze, or booze way booze. You can drink. So those are miscellaneous. The other 25 amendments have essentially been either reinforcing or listing individual rights and privileges and immunities, or changes to institutions, and we'll go over those. So historically, the first way of grouping the amendments, I think there are essentially 3 kinds of groupings here. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and those were submitted by the Congress in 1789, the first Congress, essentially drafted by James Madison and sent out to the states. And that was the last date of the founding that we talked about. 1791 is when 10 amendments were ratified, and we call those first 10 amendments, all from 1791, the Bill of Rights, because they essentially expand individual liberties, rights, and privileges and immunities. And then the second major historical grouping is what we call the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. The 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the first time the Constitution actually uses the word slave or slavery in abolishing it. The 14th Amendment, which protected the civil rights essentially and initially of former slaves that were treated unequally by the state governments after the Civil War. And so the 14th Amendment actually did 2 things. It overturned Dred Scott because it declared that all persons born are naturalized, the Dred Scott decision that we talked about earlier in the course. And so the first thing the 14th Amendment does is define citizenship by birth, which would have made Dred Scott, in that case, a citizen. But then it also addresses the unequal treatment, first of former slaves, but then also ultimately women and all ethnic and all minorities. And even the Supreme Court has seen gender minorities, for instance, as protected by the Equal Protection Clause, the Due Process Clause, etc. So essentially, the 14th Amendment extended the protections of civil rights that the Bill of Rights had given to national citizens. The 14th Amendment extended those to state citizens. And the 15th Amendment, of course, meant that race could not be used as a way of assigning the right to vote. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, 1865, 1868, and I think 1870, I have to look at the date for the 15th, all because of the Civil War and the issue of emancipation and equal civil rights after emancipation. The last historical grouping is the last amendment. The 27th Amendment was actually one of the first 12 proposed amendments, because actually Congress in 1799 sent out 12 amendments to the states, and many people think that you have to have a 7-year limit. Some of the amendments proposed over time do have that, but if an amendment doesn't have an amendment like that, like the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, which wasn't ratified within 7 years, and that was part of the amendment, then the amendments can hang around until that 3/4 majority comes, and that's exactly what happened. In 1791, the first 10 of the 12 proposed amendments became the Bill of Rights, and the other 2 amendments just kind of lay out there until in 1992, an enterprising college student went around to the state legislatures and got 3/4 of the states to ratify the 27th Amendment. which was one of the first proposed. So one of the first proposed was one of the last ratified, and that requires there to be a congressional election after a pay raise goes into effect for Congress. So those are the way to group the amendments historically. And the second way, which I've already covered, by the way, is the mode of ratification. If you turn the page for the notes for Wednesday, and only one, the 21st Amendment, I'm just repeating myself now, went through the state convention ratification. All others were ratified by state legislatures. So the last major grouping of the amendments is the theme. You can group the amendments into what kind of changes that they brought. In particular, three: individual rights and liberties and protections, institutional changes, and then miscellaneous, which was, of course, the 18th and the 21st Amendment. That's the last category. So let's just quickly walk through the amendments and see what individual liberties. In the First Amendment, there are 5 basic rights given: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. In the Second Amendment, and these are essentially limitations on Congress's power, because the First Amendment actually says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting a free religion. So, although the 14th Amendment did extend these protections to the states. So, Article 2 is the right to bear arms, which the Supreme Court has now held as an individual right, and which states and localities and the national government have to respect. Article 3, Amendment 3, no quartering of troops. Now, if you remember in the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that King was accused of doing was quartering troops. And Americans hated this so much, they put an amendment that should never happen. So no quartering of troops in times of peace. Now, this is one of the few amendments, by the way, that has never given rise to a court case, just because it's so uncontroversial. And the Fourth Amendment, the protection against arbitrary arrest and searches and seizures. And warrants, where the cops come to your house, has to be based on probable cause. And so that doesn't mean that every police search or seizure has to have a warrant, but when warrants are issued, they have to have probable cause. And so the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments are all individual protections and rights, basically within the judicial process. So if you're looking for an argument for an arrangement of the rights so far in the Bill of Rights, the first 2 amendments basically limit Congress's power and therefore kind of address the legislative branch. The 3rd and 4th Amendments restrict police or executive power. No quartering of troops, no unreasonable searches and seizures or warrants without probable cause. And then 5, 6, 7, and 8 all essentially have to do with the judicial process. So the 5th Amendment is the right to due process, the right to non-self-incrimination, and the right to not be tried with double jeopardy, to be tried for the same crime twice, for a grand jury in capital cases, and the law of eminent domain. Many of these, by the way, were codified in 1965 by the Supreme Court decision Miranda v. Arizona, and most of you have heard of Miranda rights, and those have to do especially with the 5th and 6th Amendments. The 6th Amendment actually has 6 rights in it: jury trial, speedy trial, public trial, fair trial, etc. So the 5th Amendment has 5 rights, the 6th Amendment has 6 rights, and the difference is the 5th Amendment has to do with basically the pretrial stage of accusation, indictment, and bringing a trial. The 6th Amendment has to do with keeping the trial that you actually have, which would determine guilt or innocence, fair, public, procedural, and by jury. The 7th Amendment puts the limit of a federal suit at $20, and that's just become irrelevant because of the change in the value of money. And the 8th Amendment is no excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishments, so fair punishments. The 9th and 10th Amendments have more to do with, well, one of the controversies with the Bill of Rights is some critics of a Bill of Rights argued that would mean that you think that all those are the only rights that people have. But the 9th Amendment says no. Just because a right is listed in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean that you don't have those rights. You have the right to walk on the street, even though the Constitution doesn't say you explicitly have that. Now, the 9th Amendment is also controversial because within that sphere of non-enumerated rights, the Supreme Court found the right of privacy, and of course, you know that's how the right to choose an abortion was found in the Constitution in Roe v. Wade in 1973. And then the 10th Amendment, we'll kind of come back to this, guarantees that the states, that the powers not granted to the United States government in Article 1, Section 8, that the states have all the rest of the power and the people. And we'll see some controversies about that when we look at some court cases later on. And then, still continuing with the theme of rights or individual liberties, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil War Amendments, essentially eliminated slavery. They provided in the 14th Amendment for equal civil rights and no race in voting. And then the 19th Amendment, which most of you know, passed in 1919, 1920, meant you can't deny the privilege to vote based on gender or sex. And by the way, don't forget, in different states, in 1798 in New Jersey, women had the right to vote. In 1867, I think in Wyoming, when Wyoming came, women had the right to vote. But what the 19th Amendment says is now you can't use gender to deny somebody the vote, which is an expansion of individual rights. The 23rd Amendment can go both either changing an institution, the Electoral College, adding 3 Electoral College votes, as I already mentioned above, or you can see it as an individual right because it gave presidential voting rights to the people in the District of Columbia. The 24th Amendment said you can't have a tax to vote, which was another way of often racial discrimination. And as we pointed out in class, the 26th Amendment lowered the right to vote to 18-year-olds. So when you're asking who has what are the qualifications for voting, remember, it was different in the original Constitution, and that pool has been expanded so that essentially any 18-year-old. Note, by the way, that the unamended Constitution, just as Goldwyn pointed out in the article that we read before the first exam, that there is no mention of gender in the original Constitution, even though the Constitution uses the male pronoun him. It's Goldwyn points out that it's the neutral principle because there are clearly other parts where person is used with the word his, like in the Due Process Clause, that you can't deny somebody with life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So anyway, the second major grouping then is that changes an institution. So the 11th Amendment, for instance, meant that you couldn't sue a state, that a citizen from one state couldn't sue a sovereign state. The Electoral College, we're going to come back to this. It changed the Electoral College because it separated out the separate vote for president and vice president in Article 2, Section 1. Originally, electors had 2 ballots, and both were for president. And the one who had the most votes was the president, if a majority, and then the runner-up, if a majority, had. Though the Second Amendment, because of the election of 1800, which was the 12th Amendment, passed in 1803, made a separate ballot. So electors still get 2 ballots, but one is designated for president and one is designated for vice president. It also listed the number of runoff elections if there is no majority in the Electoral College and it goes to the House. It reduced it from the top 5 vote getters to the top 3. The 16th Amendment made the income tax possible. It granted to Congress the power to pass income taxes. Yay. The 17th Amendment, again, shifted the election of senators from the state legislatures and then to the people directly. So now both the House and the Senate are directly elected by the people of the state. And then the 20th Amendment moved the time for the beginning of terms of office from March to January. Why was that? Because most elections have always been held in November in America because that's when the harvest is over and most people were farmers up until the 1900s, and that meant farmers could come into town and vote. But the Constitution was ratified in 1788 and actually went into effect. First Congress met under March 4th, 1789, so they just kind of kept that as the beginning of office. And that meant that between elections in November and the beginning of office in March, there was like a 6-month lame duck period. So the 20th Amendment moved the beginning of Congress to January 3rd and the beginning of the president's term to January 20th, and that's when it shortened the lame duck period. The 22nd Amendment put a 2-term limit on the presidency because Article 2, Section 1 doesn't say how many times a president could be elected any number of times. And of course, you know that the president who was elected more than anyone else was, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been elected 4 times. And in some ways, it is a reaction to the Roosevelt presidency that the 22nd Amendment was passed in the 1950s. The 23rd Amendment, as already said, gave 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia. The 25th Amendment, which became controversial during President Trump's reign, lists several aspects of presidential succession and disability. And there's a complex procedure for declaring a sitting president unable to hold office. And again, that was controversial this last year, and because some people wanted Vice President Pence to initiate the 25th Amendment and to declare President Trump unable to hold office. That was one of the controversies. And then, as I said, the 27th Amendment, the last amendment, actually requires a year to an election to occur before a pay raise for Congress goes into election. And the third grouping, of course, is miscellaneous. So there you have the amendments to the Constitution. And again, the first part of today's lecture was to finish up from some material from Monday, from actually today, which was actually 2 days ago, kind of, because this is actually Wednesday. All right, we will see you on Friday